Hello everyone. In this video, we shall see how to account for transaction for the expenses incurred by an head office, and later on those expenses are charged back to the Opco. So with the new methods of intercompany accounting, we shall see how this nature of transaction would be accounted in the system. So I'll first walk you through the setup. So as I informed that IELB, the offshore, have organized a training for country head for Ekistok Hong Kong through the vendor in Lebanon, and later IELB will charge back to Opco. The total cost of training is 1000 USD. So before the new mechanism of the intercompany accounting, these transactions were accounted as follows in the books of IELB. They would debit the vendor the intercompany vendor code, because previously all the transactions of intercompany were done through vendor module, and later on they will credit the training vendor. So without accounting for expenses in their book, they will do this entry, and later on when they will pay the vendor, they will debit the training vendor account and credit the cash account. Simultaneously, they will share the details with the entity Ekistok Hong Kong. They will account the transaction as cost of training debit in their books of account, and they will credit IELB account through the accounts payable module. So this is how the transaction used to happen previously. But now, through the new mechanism of the intercompany accounting, this transaction would be accounted as, we will credit the service provider, who is providing the training in the books of IELB, and we will debit an expense account by $1000. Okay, the effect of this transaction would be debit the same account V-02, and automatically, as you know, in the new system of intercompany, the transactions are linked to based on the relationships. So the affected GL would be 45001, and similarly in the books of Ekistok Hong Kong, an auto entry would be accounted, which will be creating the intercompany account directly GL and debit the expense account. So we shall see on the ERP how this transaction would be effected. So I'm in the books of IELB. The transaction will have to be accounted by IELB because they are the initiator of this transaction, and they are also the payer of this transaction to the vendor. So they have all the information of the transaction. Okay, so what they will do, they will select the company, vendor, and I've just selected a hypothetical vendor code and mention the narration and amount with 1000 US dollar. If you can see here, the entry would be vendor account credit that we have done over here, and the debit would be an expense account. But here in the offset company, we have to select Ekistok Hong Kong. Okay, and select the appropriate vendor code and the dimensions. Once you select these transactions, you may proceed to validate and further post this transaction the books of account. So I'm posting this transaction, and I will show you how the effects of this transaction would be considered in the financials. So I have extracted the trial balance of both the entities IELB and Ekistok Hong Kong. So if you can see, the accounts payable is credited. So that means this account is credited because the liability to pay this vendor lies on IELB, and the second account would be affected would be 451, the intercompany account. Okay, so you can see the intercompany transactions are account is debited. If you go and see in the books of Ekistock, you can see intercompany transaction or account is credited, as I mentioned over here, and the training expense account would be debited. So that is how the intercompany transaction would be taken into effect if it is paid by or it is incurred by the head office. So if I see in the books of Equistock Hong Kong, I can get from here the entity who had effected this transaction, that is I Engineering Lebanon. And same in the books of, of I Engineering Lebanon, you can see the transaction is effected for Equistock Hong Kong. So that is how the transaction would be effected. So here what you guys can see, that the person who is an initiator or the entity who is an initiator of this transaction would take will do an accounting of these transactions in their books of account. Okay, so you can see here they have accounted all the transaction, and the second effect is automatically given in the books of Equistra. So with this methods of accounting of intercompany, this will eliminate the reconciliation item. So one entity will pose a transaction, automatically the second or the affecting entity would be notified, and accordingly the financial effect would be taken into consideration. So in this way we will not have unreconciled item, and the intercompany reconciliation will be very smooth and easy. So thank you. That's it for this video.